So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Jasmine, and I'm the president of ASTEP, Aggies in Science, Technology, and Engineering Policy at Texas A&M. ASTEP and Texas A&M's Career Center presents today's Science Policy Career Panel. I will now pass it over to our moderator for today's event, Ms. Marilyn Yeager, and the Associate Director of Graduate Student Services at the Career Center.
Thank you, Jasmine. On behalf of ASTEP and the Career Center, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this ASTEP Science Policy Careers panel. We recognize that we're in the middle of the semester, and this is a busy time for many of you. So we especially appreciate you making the time for this special event. Today, we're focusing on science policy careers, and we're very fortunate to have a wonderful panel of 4 professionals who have diverse experiences and insights to share with you from their own careers. They work as an elected state government representative for nonprofit and not-for-profit organizations and a government relations firm. And unfortunately, Wyoming Senator Chris Rothfuss will not be joining us today for unforeseen circumstance. We'll begin the first half of this event with 6 moderated questions for the panelists, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. Jasmine has gathered your questions that you submitted with your registrations, but you are also free to add additional questions in the chat or to unmute yourself when we get to that part of the event. So let's begin with the moderated portion of this panel. And I would like to ask all of our panelists to briefly introduce yourself, tell us your name, educational background, and your current position. And we will begin with Dr. June Bando, who is joining us from California.
Thank you very much. And thanks very much for the invitation to participate in this panel today. I'm June Bando. I'm Senior Advisor to the California Council on Science and Technology. As you noted, Marilyn, we're in Sacramento, California, and we provide independent science and technology advice to the California state government. I'm an evolutionary ecologist by training with a PhD from UC Davis, the University of California, Davis. We're the other Aggies. And I also have an undergraduate degree in environmental studies from San Jose State University.
Great. Dr. Eve Granatosky is joining us from Washington, D.C.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate today. I'm Eve Granatosky. I am a principal at Lewis-Burke Associates, which is a government relations firm based in DC. We work with universities, scientific societies, and research institutions to help navigate the federal government within the research realm. My background is in biochemistry, so I earned my PhD from the University of Notre Dame in biochemistry before I started my policy career.
Great. And next we have Representative Jasmine Clark, who is joining us from, I believe, Atlanta, Georgia.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to join you all today. I am Representative Jasmine Clark. I am a state representative here in the state of Georgia. I represent Georgia's, or a small part of Georgia's second largest county, Gwinnett County. I have a PhD in microbiology, and my full-time job, because our legislature is a part-time legislature, my full-time job is lecturing in microbiology and anatomy and physiology at Emory University.
Great, thank you. And then our final panelist is Mr. Spencer Nelson, who I believe is also joining us from Washington, D.C.
That's right. Thank you so much for having me here. It's great to see all of y'all, or it's great to have your questions, even if I can't see all of you. So I'm the Senior Research Director at ClearPath. We are a clean energy policy advocacy nonprofit. So we write a lot of legislation, and we work with companies and with lawmakers to advance policy. I think I'm the only one on this panel who does not have a PhD. My background is I have a BS in quantitative biology and one in environmental sciences. I am also going to night school now for a master's of public policy to just continue my education. So happy to be here.
Great. Thank you so much for all of you making the time to be with us today. We're going to begin our second question with Dr. Granatosky. Would you please share a little bit about your career path and how your career has led to or been involved with science policy?
Yeah, I think I followed somewhat of a traditional path from a PhD into a policy career, as traditional as that can be, in that I got my PhD, I did a fellowship program, and now I work in science policy. So during my PhD, as many of you might be considering as well, thinking about what career options might be good, realizing research might not be a great fit for me in terms of what I was interested in and where my skills lie, found out through a panel similar to this that science policy was an option. You could work using your scientific background as well as pursuing other policy and politics interests. And I learned that you could do fellowships afterwards, which are similar in structure to a postdoc in that it's about a year to 2 years. You get some additional training in a particular topic, and then that sets you up for a full-time position. So following the completion of my PhD, I did a bunch of activities while I was in grad school that I'm happy to elaborate on later that helped set me up for my fellowship. And then I spent 3 different rotations. I spent some time at the National Human Genome Research Institute at NIH based in Bethesda. I spent some time working on Capitol Hill in the United States Senate, and I spent some time working at a scientific society, the American Society of Human Genetics. And so following that fellowship, I got to see policy through several different lenses and different environments. I started at my current position. I've been here almost 2 years now, where I help to connect researchers with policy. So helping them to navigate the federal government in terms of what opportunities are there to support research, what are the emerging interests in research in the government, what sort of legislation is coming up that might be beneficial or harmful for research, as well as interacting with the federal government in terms of talking with Congress about what sort of science is beneficial to be supporting, what's happening at universities in your district, how can I help connect researchers with the government to provide advice or otherwise build those bridges. So I really enjoyed that I get to do that in my career and really have a foot in both worlds. I get to talk with researchers, stay connected to the science, as well as stay connected to legislation and regulations and all sorts of things happening at the federal level. So I think it's a really good path if that's the sort of thing that you're interested in, if you have some emerging interests in different topics, but you don't want to leave too much of the science world behind. A career path similar to mine could be useful for you. So yeah, happy to get into more details later in the panel.
Thank you so much. Sounds like wonderful opportunities for lifelong learning and constant change. It sounds very interesting. Representative Clark, could you please share a little bit about your career path and how it has led to science policy?
Thank you so much for the question. And my path is a little bit less direct than Dr. Granatosky in that I had no idea I was going to go into politics at all. I kind of got here by way of just seeing problems that really needed problem solvers, and also out of a sense of duty that we needed more science voices representing us in our politics, because science was being drowned out, science was being silenced, and it wasn't being used, or it wasn't being used properly. And so I felt like we needed more science voices at the actual policymaking table. And so I decided to run for office. Again, as I said earlier, in Georgia, being a legislator is a part-time job. And so my current career is still in science. I am mostly in the classroom. I do a little bit of research, but most of my time is spent in the classroom teaching. And so I still am very much in the sciences and in my field and doing the work, and really actually kind of paying a lot more attention to curriculum development and science teaching and health education. However, I think that it was really important, it is really important to have people who know how to read graphs and who know how to interpret data sitting at the decision-making table when someone is making a presentation, to a bunch of lawmakers, and you can dress up anything if you make a pretty enough graph. So you kind of need that person in the room that can raise their hand and say, wait a minute, or just the person in the room that can ask the right questions. And so I say this to say that there might be people here today that might not think that going into politics or running for office is something that is for you, but we actually really do need people with a little bit of a diversity of background and diversity of thought sitting in those policy-making, decision-making rooms. And so that's how I got here. So thank you for the question.
I hope some of the students present really consider that and answer your call to action. Mr. Spencer Nelson, could you tell us a little bit about your career path and how that's led you to science policy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope I can be helpful in talking a little bit about the role of nonprofits and think tanks, which I know can be kind of a murky thing, but is a big part of how federal policy happens in particular. So I started out doing genetics research, both at my university and then at the NIH down in North Carolina. But I felt like a lot of the work that we were doing, which was very early stage genetics and trying to understand the relationship between different responses in neonatal mice, it felt very disconnected from a lot of the on the ground needs. So I kind of pivoted and decided to look at some other options. So I found ClearPath, the place where I'm currently working. And I thought it was really interesting because it's very focused on trying to get bipartisan clean energy solutions and trying to depoliticize climate change to find some common ground. And through that work, we really focused on trying to work with different companies to understand what their challenges were to scaling up clean energy technology, and then take those challenges and turn them into actionable legislation that could be bipartisan in Congress. In doing so, and just constantly building up new legislation and working with legislators, I got to know a lot of staffers really well. So I got hired to work on the Senate Energy Committee when there was an opening because they needed someone who really understood a lot about energy innovation policy. And I really found kind of going from a lab to then a nonprofit, I was able to, take a lot of those skills and translate them into the policy context. And then because I spent a couple of years working in a nonprofit, just thinking just purely about the ideas, I already knew what I wanted to do when I went into working in the Senate. And then being in the Senate, as Eve and Jasmine both mentioned, it's really important to have people who are numerate and can work through big issues and understand how the science works, how math works, because otherwise, there are going to be lobbyists who can kind of fool you on things. So when I was there, I worked really hard on a big energy policy that I was the lead negotiator for, that was enacted at the end of last year, which was like reauthorizing all the Department of Energy research programs. And it is super important to have people working in Congress who understand how research works and why it matters. And then since then, I've left the Hill and I've come back to ClearPath to be research director and looking kind of at a long-term trajectory of clean energy innovation policy.
Thank you so much. And then next we'll have Dr. June Bando. Please share your path and how it has led to science policy.
Thank you. Well, like Representative Clark, I think my path has been pretty nonlinear, so I thought I'd approach this segment in a nonlinear way as well, with a little story. So I'm going to ask you to imagine that you've been in the science policy world for a couple of years, and you're on a work trip when you get a phone call from your boss who says, hey, can you jump on a plane to attend a meeting that's popped up for tomorrow? And all they tell you about the meeting is that it's going to be a working level discussion with a number of technical experts from your field. You show up for the meeting, and as you walk into the room, you realize that the participants are 6 foreign ministers, so equivalents of our US Secretary of State, a deputy foreign minister, and you're there as the US government representative. Well, this actually happened to me when I was a policy fellow at the State Department with a couple of years of experience under my belt. And of course, the solution in this case was for the embassy personnel, my colleagues from the embassy, to run and try to contact the ambassador to ask him to attend the meeting. And as it turns out, he had a conflict. And he said, just tell June to take the meeting. And so this is one of many of what I describe as Forrest Gump moments during my experience working in the policy world, which has been filled with fascinating and sometimes surprising experiences. Like Dr. Granatosky, I entered the policy world through a fellowship. I served as an American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the State Department in Washington, D.C. I had 2 fellowship assignments at the State Department. The first was serving as this regional science and technology advisor for the Americas. So I had a policy coordination role that covered regional environment, science, technology, and health issues for the Western Hemisphere. For my second assignment, I took on a peace and security portfolio in the Africa Bureau because I was determined that I was going to step outside of my comfort zone a little bit more. And so this portfolio included coordinating US diplomatic responses to incidents of piracy off the coast of Somalia. It included working closely with the US military to support the establishment of a geographic combatant command with responsibility for Africa. So United States Africa Command has responsibility for the full spectrum of US military operations in Africa. And so these experiences working in national security and in the science and technology policy realm led to doors opening to work at other levels in the State Department and eventually in the Department of Defense. And as I had these additional opportunities, the scope of the work expanded beyond policy to also touch on strategy and to help leaders think about how to transform organizations to work together more effectively and efficiently. And so I've now been able to take some of those skills and experiences back to my home state of California. And I currently work with the California Council on Science and Technology, focused on helping the organization to think long-term about strategic opportunities and challenges that are over the horizon, and also thinking about how we can develop our organization to be more effective with a strong emphasis on enhancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, so that as we're providing science and technology advice to the California state government, we're doing it in a way that really addresses the needs of California's populations and of course, the California state government.
I just have to share, I'm so grateful that all of you are working in this field, and I'm really honored that you're here and in awe of the work that you're involved with. Thank you very much. For question 3, we'll begin with Representative Clark. I'm sure that the students are curious about how they could fit in this world and would like to hear about typical positions for graduate students or all students within the science policy world. Would you, and I realize that you're one person, but could you share your insights into science opportunities within the Georgia legislature or generally within state government or in an academic setting?
Yes, absolutely. So actually, there are opportunities in all 3 of those things that you just named. So down at the state capitol, we have several staffers and interns that work at the state capitol, and some of them are going to be focusing on science policy. And I know we have that at the state level, and although I'm not at the federal level, I'm pretty confident we have something similar at the federal level as well. But when it comes to at the state level, either individual representatives could hire interns to help them with certain policy, and they'll ask like your passion, what is your passion, and to see if that aligns with their legislative agenda. But also we have different committees, and we actually have state staff that is staffers that work for the state of Georgia, and they can work for certain committees as well and play a role in that way, doing a little bit of background research. We also have the House Research and Budget Office and all these different opportunities at the state level. But if you're not wanting to necessarily work with a legislator or work, in that way, there are also opportunities all throughout Georgia, all throughout the country. There are opportunities to work with nonprofits and to work with organizations that are either advocating or lobbying for science policy. So if you're not in the legislator's office, you might be visiting the legislator's office to advocate for or lobby for a certain policy that has a science focus. I mean, we see this a lot. We see this a lot with environmental justice. We see this a lot with lots of things that have to do with science. And we actually really do need those people to who can kind of come in and explain the science to a bunch of representatives that do not have PhDs and do not necessarily know what's going on at all, where you are the expert and you've got to bring it to them and try to get them to understand certain policies. And then in academia, as well, there are opportunities to do nursing, I'm saying nursing because I work at a school of nursing. There are opportunities to do science policy as well from the university side. At the Emory School of Nursing, we do have entire courses dedicated to nursing policy. And they have that in other departments as well, where the science policy is coming from an academic setting and students are really taking the time to work through issues, decide who to contact, how to contact them, and bringing those issues to their representation, their elected officials. So there's so many opportunities for students to get involved, whether that's running for office or working for someone who has a similar vision to you, or lobbying for specific policies, to actually dedicating your educational career to going into policy. All of these things are available to students, just depending on where you see yourself and what you would like to do with your future. So, the sky's the limit when it comes to using your science background and using that science education to affect change in our political spaces.
So many times you're trying to think, how can you have an impact? So your words were very encouraging. Thank you. Mr. Nelson, would you share some opportunities either within ClearPath or more generally in nonprofit organizations, or from your opening remarks, maybe even legislative committees?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, just like Representative Clark said, there's a lot more jobs in science policy than you might expect at first glance. They're really just kind of all over the place. Here at our organization, we have a policy team of 10 people, and they're each individually experts. There's one who's a nuclear expert. We have a carbon capture expert, a renewable energy expert. And we found that the folks who are most successful in those jobs do have an actual science background because they're able to communicate very well. And then on the committees, when I was in Congress, it always was so helpful to have people who were working there who had the science background, because even if lobbyists might also have a science background, you're always not quite sure if you can quite trust exactly what they're saying. Another thing that I think a lot of people don't know about is that there's a huge kind of behind the scenes research arm called the Congressional Research Service, which is part of the Library of Congress. And they are really a big function of what makes Congress work well. So there's a lot of opportunities there. And I'm sure Eve can talk a little bit more about fellowships, so I'll skip that. And then I'd also mention that, each of the departments within the administration are also really huge. So you could work on policy at NIH, or at HHS, or at the Department of Energy, whatever your specialty is, there's going to be a place for that, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. huge piece of what keeps our federal apparatus going, and it's all physicists basically, and math PhDs. So there's a lot that you can do in the nonprofit space if you find an organization that you really resonate with their mission, or within Congress, or especially look at a lot of the agencies, because they're actually doing a lot of the work on the ground, and they're making their own policy just as much as Congress is or the White House is.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Bando, would you share opportunities with the California Council on Science and Technology, or more generally with nonprofit 501 organizations, or from your opening remarks, Department of State? You've had diverse experiences.
Thank you for the question. I'll start out by talking about a fellowship opportunity with the California Council on Science and Technology. We have a program where we take PhD level scientists from across the range of social sciences, physical and biological sciences, and medicine, and place them in the California state government in either the legislature or the executive branch for a year of public service. And our fellows are embedded into the staffs of their host offices, where they provide daily support to the policymaking process. And they also gained invaluable experience in policy development and implementation, as well as leadership. That's a one-year fellowship. And I know that Jasmine has shared information with the registrants for this panel. We've also got a lot of information on our California Council for Science and Technology, CCST website. And I'm also happy to serve as a point of contact for anyone who's interested. For a lot of our science fellows, many of them come directly out of graduate school or postdocs, and the fellowship is often an opportunity to really pivot and step into the science policy world. So most of our fellows stay on in the policy world in some capacity, either working in the state government or working in other sectors of policy that intersect with the government. I mentioned that I had the opportunity to serve as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow, which was a fantastic experience. Our CCST fellowship program is actually modeled after that federal program. I guess I'd like to take the opportunity to make one point, which is that I think that the skills that we develop as we're working in the science policy arena are often exportable outside of science policy. That was certainly my experience. I mentioned having some pretty diverse experiences as a AAAS fellow, and I went on from there to work as a special assistant to the senior policy official for Sub-Saharan Africa at the State Department, and then was recruited by the Department of Defense and had the opportunity to serve as an advisor to 5 geographic combatant commanders. And these are commanders who have responsibility for the full spectrum of military operations in approximately 1/6 of the globe, each of the commanders. So their portfolios, their responsibilities are very diverse. And what I discovered after stepping into that world was there was a real thirst for people who could help with problem solving by bringing in an outside perspective. And so the fact that I had been trained as a scientist and was stepping into a world that wasn't inherently focused on science was actually really valuable to these organizations and leaders. I was able to bring in other points of view to challenge conventional thinking by maybe posing questions in a different kind of way. And so the skills that we bring as scientists or people who work in science policy can be really important to decision-making processes that are far outside of science policy. And I think Representative Clark was touching on some of this earlier with some of her comments.
Dr. Granatosky, either opportunities in Lewis-Burke Associates or more generally with other firms that provide services and to governments?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything the other panelists have said, really reiterating that fellowships are a great way to get into science policy, especially if you know that that's what you want to do. I think there are also a lot of opportunities to get involved in science policy as a graduate student, perhaps before you've made that career decision, or if you know you want to move into it, but you still want to have some of that experience. And so there are a few fellowships that you can do while you are a graduate student. One of them is the Mirzayan Fellowship through the National Academies of Sciences. That's a fellowship that is about 4 months long, and you work at the National Academies advising on a variety of different projects. So you get to sort of dip your feet into it while you're still a student. There's also a lot of opportunities that are available through scientific societies. So that's a lot of the clients that we work with are scientific societies. So we work with policy departments at those societies to help engage their members in the policymaking process. So a lot of societies will have Hill Days where you can come out of the lab for a day, visit Capitol Hill, or virtually in this sort of COVID environment, but you can go and talk about the importance of your research. So I work on a lot of biomedical issues. So a lot of the Hill Days that I've either been involved with as a student while I was in grad school, or that I help supervise now, are talking about the importance of NIH funding and support for biomedical research. So you can do one-off things like that. There are also a lot of volunteer opportunities through scientific societies. There's almost always some sort of policy committee at societies, so you can volunteer to serve on that. You can participate in sort of short-term training programs that your societies might put together. There might be a certificate program or some sort of mini fellowship opportunity that you can do through your society. So I think that's a really great way to get involved that makes sense. You know, a lot of graduate students are members of scientific societies. You already sort of have an in, you understand what that group does, and it's something that you feel passionate about. So you can go out and practice your advocacy skills, practice talking to the Hill, and build some of those skills and really see if policy is for you and if that's something that you would like to do further along in your career.
Excellent idea. And that's one thing that I'm hoping this panel will encourage students to become involved in activities outside of their degree, outside of their curriculum, and those were excellent suggestions. We're going to move on to the next question, and we'll begin with Mr. Nelson. What advice would you give to students? Every panel, this is really foremost on their mind and in their questions. How can students stand out in a positive way? Are there any, some of these skills have already been touched upon, but absolutely could be repeated or I think of the correct word I want to use, emphasized how important skills are. Any particular skills or experiences that will help them get their first job, strengths or personal qualities that would be important working in science policy. And we'll begin with Mr. Nelson.
Yeah, thank you. There are definitely a couple. One is more of a practical skill and one is more of an outlook, I would say. In terms of practical skill, what's really, really important is clear communication. I find that, you know, everything that happens in policy is usually, it gets reduced down to kind of like a sound bite. Whether you want it to or not, regardless of how important the issue is or how, you know, how many people are going to be impacted by it, if it's going to be reduced down to a soundbite, and you need to be really, you know, good at communicating very clearly, not only like the science itself, but also the long-term impacts of that in a way that you can back up when you have to, but also that is clear enough that people who don't have that science understanding can understand. So anything you can do to get involved in writing or in public speaking or something now can be really helpful so that you have that skill, because that's going to be really important starting immediately with like how you write your cover letter for that job, for that first science policy job or for that interview. And then that's something that continues onward. The most important thing for me for getting to my first job was that I did some lobbying on behalf of the university to try to overturn a renewable energy prevention issue in North Carolina where we couldn't build solar on campus, and being forced to, you know, have to actually go and lobby when I was still in school helped me understand that communication problem firsthand. But there are also ways that you can work on that. The second thing is in terms of like a personal outlook, perseverance is really, really important. Policy making can be really depressing and difficult at times, and you have a lot of losses. You win a lot, but there are always going to be wins too. For example, like the really big energy law that we passed in December 2020. I've been working on that for 2 years in the Senate. And we came to the floor of the Senate with the bill. It had already been together. It was fully bipartisan. It was going to be great. And we came to the floor of the Senate in March of 2020. And then another issue flew out of nowhere. We lost a bunch of senators within the span of a week, and it failed on the floor. Then we spiraled into COVID. I got really depressed. But then we just kept pushing, and we're like, how can we step back and redo it? And then we spent, 4 months working on it, and we managed to come up with a new bipartisan agreement, and it got enacted at the end of 2020. Everybody else in like the policy community and the companies, they all kind of left us for dead. But we kept persevering, and we actually got it done. And that's true for any type of science policy. Things can seem the darkest just before the dawn, and having perseverance is really critical.
That's an amazing story, and I'm glad that you prevailed after much effort. Dr. Bando, what comes to mind about the ways that students can stand out or prepare for science policy careers?
Thanks. Well, I agree with everything we've just heard, and some of this is going to intersect with that, but I wanted to offer 4 things. And the first is a growth mindset. As we've just heard, the policy environment can be pretty challenging. And I think that success in the policy world, like success in science, really hinges on our ability to be resilient. And I think that the business of doing science fundamentally is about trying new things, and sometimes things don't work. And we learn that the failure of an experiment or the rejection of a grant proposal or of a paper shouldn't be career ending or soul crushing, right? We sort of learn from these experiences, regroup, and move on. And I think that in science policy, and really in any sector, that kind of growth mindset where we accept that sometimes things aren't going to go the way that we expect, and that we're going to learn from those experiences, and that we learn the most when we were pushed outside of our comfort zones. I think that is something that I really look for. That's the first thing, growth mindset. I would also, look for evidence of a real sincere interest in policy. And so, are you really interested in learning about the policy process and about contributing to the greater good? I think that's also that really stands out. In talking to people, I'm always very struck by the ability of others to articulate how they've been able to contribute to creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive climate in their organization or their school or their community. And I think that's something that's increasingly important as we think about building the kinds of teams that will be necessary to solve our current and future problems. And the last thing that I wanted to touch on was the importance of integrity and personal integrity. And of course, this isn't unique to science policy, but the policy world has a lot to do with influence and power, and people who can move in that world without compromising their relationships and their personal and professional integrity, I think can be especially powerful. And those are the kinds of people that I like to work with and mentor.
In listening to your answer, it just made me think about how important it is for students to do assessments on their values and really find opportunities or career paths that are aligned well with their values, and that those values are strengths in those areas. So thank you very much. Dr. Granatosky, how would you recommend students prepare or personal strengths or qualities that would be important in this field?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Dr. Bando said in terms of really showing a passion and a commitment to policy. I think a lot of folks come to science policy wanting to maybe get away from the bench or get away from doing research. And that's only the first step of it. You know, you don't want to get into policy just because it isn't research. You want to have a really good reason for why you want to do this, why your heart's in it. Sort of what Spencer was saying as well, it can be tough at times. And so you want to have that internal motivation, and really the why of why you're doing science policy is really key. I think another thing is being able to balance a lot of different tasks. You know, you have that when you're a grad student in terms of different experiments and things are on different timelines and all of that. But I think in the policy realm, being able to focus on a lot of different issues at once and being able to work quickly, focus on just what you really need to get done in that particular moment. You know, you don't have a ton of time for deep dives on every single topic. So being able to figure out what you need to know, just how much you need to know, maybe who you need to talk to about the next thing, I think is really important. And being open to new opportunities. So when I worked on the Hill, I did a health portfolio and an education portfolio, and I had never really worked on education issues before. You know, I was a graduate student, but I didn't really know much about that as a issue space. And so being open to, yes, sure, I'll work on this education issue. Yes, I'll learn about this. I'll go to this event. I'll go to this hearing, whatever. I think that like willingness to try new things is really important. And you can do that while you're a grad student as well. And being able to demonstrate that on job applications, cover letters, that you're open to it, you're willing, you'll do what it takes to learn about whatever topic you need to, I think is really important.
Thank you very much. And Representative Clark, thoughts that you might have that either align with what we've already heard or other suggestions for how students can prepare or stand out in this field?
Absolutely. So I 100% agree with what the first three panelists said, and I think that they covered quite a few bases. One thing that I would add is when you are, if you are seeking to work for a particular representative, and you're going to try to go that route, one thing that would make you really stand out would be to look up their district and look up the numbers in their district of a policy that's important to you and bring that to them. Get so specific that it shows that not only do you have a passion for policy, but you have actually done the research and you actually know what's going on in their district, and you have a desire to do something that will help them. And that's if you're going to go work for someone specific. But outside of that, I agree that having that passion for policy is important. I would also say, while yes, you should be open to learning new things, I think it's also a good idea to kind of choose a subject that you are just going to be a rock star at, no matter what. Like, you have the information and you know it. That is not to say that you should not know other things, but I think it's really nice to have someone in the room that can really, off the top of their head, off the cuff, just really come with information because they know it. This is their thing. This is their passion. And I think that's something that could go very far, especially if you go into advocacy or lobbying for example, something having to do with climate change. Then if you're going to do that, know something very specific about climate change. Like, don't just say the earth is burning. Like, have something that you're actually passionate about, that you feel that you would bring to the table. And so those are the things that I would say, especially from my perspective as someone who hires interns. It's really nice when someone comes in and you can tell they've done their homework and they know what they're talking about and they know their stuff, and they not just know their stuff, but they know my stuff too. That makes it, that's definitely makes someone stand out.
I think that's excellent universal advice. If you can show your passion and you've researched the organization or the individual, and you have ideas, what you can bring to the table to help with the work that needs to be done. I mean, that's perfect. And I hope that all the students will do that. Thank you. So for question 5, we're gonna begin again with Dr. Bando. So when you think back about your educational process and your early career, what skills that you, and this might overlap a little bit with the previous question, but what skills have do you most value now, and why, that have helped you in your career?
Thank you. So I'll start out by addressing something that Spencer touched on earlier, but the ability to translate complex information and ideas. So the ability to distill issues down and then translate them for a non-technical audience is really, really important. And I think that's something that really came out of my science education and has been really helpful in every job. And so, that gets back to, it's an issue of both problem framing and communications. That's the first area I'd highlight. The second area is the ability to work across disciplines. And so our ability to work with people who have different areas of expertise and who come from backgrounds who are different than ours, that's a really, really important skill set to have in policy. And it's fundamental to being able to build trust and teamwork and to be able to build actionable solutions to address policy problems. The last two things I've already talked about a little bit, so I won't belabor them, but I think the willingness to embrace risk is important. And I think that some of the most rewarding opportunities that I've had to serve and to learn have come about because I've been willing to take some kind of risk to step into an area of work that is new to me. And then I also touched on the importance of resilience. And again, I think that's something that a lot of people who work in the sciences learn through the business of doing science. And it's also something that I think we have to continue to invest in as individuals as we go through our careers.
Very much. And that when you do science, part of it is just taking risks. You can't really do scientific work without taking risks and having failure. So they really, science and policy really complement one another, or the skills to succeed in both areas really complement one another. Thank you. Dr. Granatosky, what do you value from your education and early career, and why?
Yeah, I think the most valuable thing I took from graduate school was the ability to be able to work on different projects and, put a decent amount of effort and my full abilities into everything that I was working on. So I did spend a lot of time when I was in grad school pursuing my interests in science policy. I did Hill Days with my scientific societies. I founded a science policy group at Notre Dame, so that took up a lot of time as well. So I had a lot of extracurriculars, if you will, outside of my main research project. And then at the same time, you have individual sub-projects within your research. So being able to keep all of those balls in the air, if you will, and focus on different things has really served me well in my career now. At our firm, we work with, it's almost 50 different clients. So we work with so many different people in the same day. So you have to be able to switch really quickly on what particular topic, what issues, where people are coming from. And I think that's a really big thing that Dr. Bando mentioned as well, building teamwork and understanding your audience when you're communicating, and then also understanding where other folks are coming from too. So understanding people's backgrounds, figuring out why they're concerned about an issue, figuring out, common ground that you might have if you don't agree with someone. So I think being a good listener and being able to absorb information, both technical information and then some of that more soft sort of information that you get in interacting with people, are good skills to have in a policy career.
Representative Clark, what do you value from your educational and early career experiences?
So I always love this question because I did not know that I was ever going to go into politics until I did. I never thought that I would have my name on a ballot until I did. And so then when I won and I got there, It's like, what am I doing here? I'm not a lawyer. I am not a business owner. I am definitely sticking out like a sore thumb. And so then I asked myself, like, what does my background bring to the table outside of thinking about things in a different way? How could I actually use my skills from my education in science to be a good legislator? And I quickly found that a lot of my colleagues don't actually read bills. And I understand there's a lot of bills, there's a lot going on. But I found that just simply reading bills and looking for questions to ask, very similar to what we do when we go to seminar and we read a scientific paper and we're really trying to break down, get down to a deeper level than the superficial. That's actually a good skill to have as a legislator as well, because all of a sudden you're asking questions that maybe get to the meat of an issue that are not necessarily things that anyone was expecting anyone to like think of. Also, like Dr. Granatosky said, knowing your audience and also knowing, kind of the person who may disagree with you, understanding where they're coming from. I think when I think about my time in preparing for my dissertation defense or preparing to present one of my papers at a seminar, or present my research at a seminar, you don't just anticipate the questions that are like the softball, the easy questions. You also anticipate the more difficult questions. You try to prepare yourself for those questions that are going to take a little bit more thought. Maybe I don't like to use the word antagonizing, but kind of the opposing questions to what you are presenting. That is good practice for being in a room full of people that do not agree with you. And it is really good practice for being prepared to argue your point to people who have a completely different perspective or opinion than you do. And so I think those two skills are two that were immediately translatable to going from being in science, getting a PhD, to being in the legislature and being basically presented with information and having to decode, decipher, and question that information. And then another thing that I will say is over time, I've learned to celebrate the small victories. I think we touched on this a little bit by other panelists, but I have really started to sharpen my skills on not always expecting the big win, but to appreciate the small wins. So if any of you all are in bench science, you know that time when you did that experiment and you did it 3 times and it didn't quite go the way you wanted to, and then you finally got that one experiment to work. Now, this is not the experiment that writes your paper. This is not the overall experience, but you are happy that you finally got this experiment through. And we celebrate those small victories. We celebrate those victories on those experiments that went the way we wanted to, or we got the result we were expecting. And you have to kind of do that when you're a legislator as well. You may not stop a bad bill from getting through, but you might water down a bad bill to not as bad as it would have been. And while that still does not feel like a victory, it is a victory if you got rid of something really bad out of a really, really bad bill. Also, sometimes you might get the hearing and maybe not necessarily get the vote. That is at least the beginning of a conversation. That is a victory, even if it's not the victory that you're looking for. And so these are all things that I have taken into legislating and things that I am continuing to grow and evolve in as I am now have been a legislator for a little amount of time.
I really appreciate those comments about appreciating the small victories and the small forward steps. I think right now it's just it's been a very challenging year, and it's stressful to be a graduate student under normal circumstances, and it's a little more complicated being in the middle of a pandemic and all of the adaptions. So I think just for all of our mental health, if we can can celebrate those small victories and feel gratitude for that. I think it really does help us be more resilient and keep moving forward in a productive way. Thank you so much. Mr. Nelson, what do you appreciate from your education and early career that has helped you?
Everybody, all the other panelists' expressions have been wonderful so far. I want to second Representative Clark's mention of celebrating the small wins, because usually you have to have the small wins in order to be able to have the big wins. You can't go from 0 to 100 in 1 year. You know, it takes time to build up the coalition. It takes time to build up the knowledge and the understanding to be able to get the big thing done. And you should celebrate those moments because they are necessary. A couple of other things that I don't think were mentioned that I value are related to the ability to decipher and understand what's going on in text, because there's so many different policies happening all the time. And that's the ability to really quickly be able to know how to research something that's new to you, because there's a process to be able to know which sources are valid, know who to trust when you're asking about a new topic, and how to do like quick Google searches and back of the envelope math. All of that is going to be constantly happening. If you're working in science policy, usually you never have as much time to spend on one topic as you would like. And so the ability to know how to distill things from secondary sources and other sources into something that you can trust and verify in a short amount of time, it's really hard to get those skills unless you have a science background. Yeah.
And can I just totally agree with what Spencer was saying there. And I think getting comfortable with that as a scientist can be tough sometimes, because we are trained to get into the details and know everything we can possibly know about something. And we're not really trained to answer questions off the cuff without a ton of background research. So I would say that's also a challenge of working in science policy. You know, you have to get comfortable with working like that and really build up that skill and being able to function in that kind of environment. So completely agree. Yep.
Just very grateful for all of your comments and suggestions. So we're to our final moderated question. Maybe thinking back about your career, is there something that you wished someone had shared with you that would have helped you navigate your career path? Any final words of advice or anything that you wish that you had known when you began your career? And we'll begin with Dr. Granatosky, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I think earlier in my career, you know, I'm still pretty new at having a career, but I think when I was a grad student and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, you know, I got a lot of go into academia, go into industry. You know, there were very set career paths for scientists that this is how you do it, and that's the support that I'm going to give you. So I think that all of you are in a great position that your institution is offering you this sort of outlet where you can talk to people in different kind of careers. I think increasingly there is more acceptance and support for other careers that aren't just academia and industry. And there's really a sense that those are valuable contributions and are really part of the science ecosystem. So policy is very much part of how science as an enterprise gets done in our country, around the world. There are other career paths as well that are really integral to the conduct of science that isn't just working in a research lab. So I think having that sort of validation earlier on would have been helpful for some of those moments when you're kind of doubting yourself and you're not really sure if you're on the right path or not. I think finding out about people that are working in this field and showing you that this is a way to go would be really helpful. And I think something that I've learned, even in the short time that I've been in policy, has been to be open to those new experiences. So when I started graduate school, I didn't know that science policy as a field existed. When I started my science policy fellowship, I didn't really understand that government relations as a field existed. And now that I'm here working in government relations, every day, every week, I meet people that are in different types of jobs or that work for different types of companies that take a slightly different approach to lobbying or approach to government relations. And so I think that's going to be something I'm going to try to continue on as I move further in my career, is just being open to those things and learning about what's out there, because you don't know what you don't know, right? So like being open to learning about those new opportunities, I think is going to be really important.
That's so true. You don't know what you don't know. So your suggestions about being open and talking to professionals is so important. Thank you. Representative Clark, anything you wished you knew? Well, since you couldn't have predicted where your career was going to go, that might be a little difficult, but maybe words of advice, final words of advice.
Yeah, so I had no idea I was going to go into politics. So that being said, me being in politics, it's very new to me. But to echo what Dr. Granatosky said, I do think that when you go into academia, especially when you pursue a PhD, a lot of times the paths post-PhD seem to already be charted for you. And to deviate from that path, there really is not a whole lot of support outside of that. I think that is changing now. When I was in graduate school, to do anything other than want to start your own lab or, do a postdoc and then start your own lab, to do anything outside of that was seen as kind of like, well, what was the point? And now I think people are a lot more open to alternative careers outside of academia. And being open to that means that there are a lot more opportunities for students to learn about these opportunities outside of academia. And so take advantage of it. Things like what we're doing today are really important, but don't just stop here. And if there are opportunities for you to kind of test the waters and, dip your toe in and see if this is something that you want to do, I encourage you to do that. I think there was a mention of a fellowship that can be done while you're in graduate school. Take advantage of things like that and just see if this is something that you're interested in. You might find that, it sounded great on paper, but then when you did it, it's not necessarily the route you wanted to go. If you think you want to run for office, contact someone who is in office and ask if you can shadow them or just kind of see or work with them and, just kind of see the day-to-day operations of being a legislator and decide if that is something that you want to do. But I think that the best piece of advice I can give people is to be open to new opportunities and to seek out new opportunities. And, whether you know for sure you want to go into science policy or you're not quite sure you want to go into science policy and you just want to try it out, do it. Like, don't talk yourself out of it. That is the advice I'm going to give you. Do not talk yourself out of it, because I am very good at that. So I'm telling you not to do that.
I appreciate that comment. Mr. Nelson, final words of advice.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot. In terms of like continuing the theme of don't talk yourself out of it, I was pretty politically active in high school, and really wanted to make a difference. I was like, wow, I should get involved in campaigns and stuff. And I got very depressed after 2010 and the big red wave and everything. And I said, I'm just going to do science and I'm going to stay away from politics, because I just felt like it was so acrimonious. But then later, fell back into the science policy arena rather than politics. And it can be as political as you want it to be.
And that was something that I didn't realize, because I thought like, oh, if you're anywhere near politics or government, that is going to be horribly political. If you want political stuff, you can find that in science policy. You can also find places where it's much less political. And if I had known that, I probably wouldn't have gone as hard into science as I did, which was good, I suspect, to have those skills, but I had no idea at the time. The second thing I think it's really important to know is that it can be really difficult to imagine going into government, because you're like, oh, I don't understand how all this works. This is a totally different foreign world. But also remember that 9 times out of 10 in a science policy environment, you're going to be the expert in the room on your topic. And no other people are not going to be the expert on whatever your level of specialty is, especially if you're in if you're working on a science policy that's directly related to your field of expertise. So everybody brings a different level of expertise, and most people don't get started in this field knowing how it works. And it's actually a lot easier to learn policy and government than it is to learn science. So if you're coming in it from knowing science and then going into policy and politics, that's easier to learn than the other way around, and trying to be a policymaker who has to suddenly understand nuclear engineering or genetics or something. So you're actually already on a really good footing. And then just to reiterate the previous comments, yeah, take all the opportunities that you have now to meet new people and learn things as much as you can.
Thank you for your comments that are encouraging to making transition from science into policy, that it is possible and not, this insurmountable hill that you have to try to cross over. So thank you very much. And Dr. Bando, final words of advice that we'd like to share.
Thanks. Well, I really appreciate the words of advice that we've heard so far. And I would just add 2 thoughts to that. And the first is that it's really important to invest in building the life that you want to live. And I know it's almost trite to talk about work-life balance, but I think that the policy world, like other sectors, can be pretty exciting and all-consuming. And I think it's really important that we invest in ourselves. And so, our health, our relationships, the other dimensions of our lives that make us good humans. I think that's really important to keep in mind. And the other thought that I'd offer is that it's important to invest in developing ourselves as leaders. And often, particularly when we're coming out of the sciences, we don't necessarily prioritize that. And then we find ourselves in leadership positions where we're guiding teams, or supporting people who are leading large teams. And so I think that looking for opportunities to learn and develop in this regard, this can be a mix of education and training, and finding opportunities to work in the proximity of good leaders where you can actually see good leadership in action, is something that I'd really encourage everyone to seek out.
To all of the participants that are joining us today, now it's a wonderful opportunity to hear from you. If we would love to hear any of your questions, you can unmute yourself or put a question in the chat. Jasmine has also gathered questions that you submitted with your registrations. So does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask of the guest speakers? And Jasmine, if you can help me monitor the chat and make sure I don't miss anything. There is a question. Could you rename the fellowship? I missed it. And there were several fellowships. And thank you, Jasmine, for putting the S&T policy and the AAAS and the CCSC. Was there an additional fellowship that was mentioned that was not one of those 4?
I think Hasnain had his hand raised and he might have a question. So
Yeah, thank you. I had a question for the panelists, and this was like in regards to choosing your graduate degree program. So now that there are some science and technology policy related masters or masters in environmental policy or masters in sustainable policy, would you recommend someone who has just gone through the undergrad program to kind of move towards these policy based master's program, or would you still recommend them to do a tech oriented master's and gather the policy experience through fellowships and these non-traditional educational or experience-based routes?
Great question.
I'll give this one a stab, as I'm currently in a master's of public policy. So I've thought a lot about it. I think it really depends on your own long-term career goals. If you know that you're committed to doing policy going forward, then it can be helpful to have those very specific skills that are more policy oriented. If you just want to try it out or something first, I think it might be better to try and get a job first as a fellow to understand whether you want to go in that direction before you make a commitment one way or another on the next step. Either one can be helpful, but you should try and make sure you know the right direction of your longer term career before you make that big of a commitment one way or another.
I have a question. This is Jody. So I heard that if you would take a policy job up in Washington and working for a representative on the Hill, a lot of the younger employees spend like 80 hours a week working just to be able to, get bills out and so forth. Can you give some comments on like the work life in policy in that area? Thanks.
Yeah, I can take this one since I've worked in a couple different sectors. So I would say the Hill is certainly one of the busier places to do science policy. I think there is a very hurry up and do everything very quickly, be responsive to your constituents, be responsive to politics and the media and all of that. There is definitely that pace on the Hill, and I think it varies a lot throughout the year and what sort of things are happening in Congress. If you're rushing to finish up things before a deadline, or if you have a particular bill that you're trying to get out, it really depends on the time of year. I will say there are some times on the Hill that are a little bit slower. So during the August recess season, for instance, that's when members of Congress are home in their districts, doing work with their constituents in their states or in their districts. Things are a little bit slower on the Hill. So it depends on the time of year. I would say it also depends in the private sector how busy you are. So working at NHGRI and their policy shop wasn't quite as hectic and time urgent as working on the Hill. Working at Lewis-Burke Associates is a little bit in between. So because we are responsive to our clients, we have to be working pretty much and be on top of things and keep up to date. But I think it definitely depends on the sector. Personally, for me, I've observed a lot more work-life balance working in policy than I did working in academia. I think a lot of grad students also find themselves always tied to their work, going into the lab on weekends, working in evenings. And I will say I don't really work on the weekends that much in policy, maybe read one or two things on the news, but you're not as required to be there in the lab every single day as you are in academia. So I think experiences will vary depending on the sector, but I've personally found that it's a better balance than academia.
That's absolutely true. And it also depends on which aspect of policy you're in. Congress can be very busy, but if you are if you are a career staffer who is non-political, who's working in a science-related agency, you'll have a much more regular work schedule. So it kind of depends on how political your job is and how responsive your job has to be to random crises that pop up.
And CJ, you have your hand raised.
Thank you.
CJ Pommier, and I am a PhD chemist and starting a second career currently in law school. And I'm really interested in how to find science policy related think tanks. Can you recommend a resource that I could use to look for places that focus in science policy?
I feel like that's a Spencer question.
So just like general science, is there a specific subcategory that unfortunately, I wish that there was something that was like just, but aside from like national academies or AAAS, there's not something that's just like science itself. Is there a specific field that you're interested in?
Well, my specialty is like biotechnology and healthcare. So if there's, I mean, really just any place to get started to look for think tanks that do science policy.
Sure. This is something that must exist. I will take a note to get something, and maybe we can send it out to everyone who attended or something. Is that possible? Okay, cool. Yeah, I will find, I'm sure this exists. I'll find it. Yeah.
Just a first thought, maybe a professional organization like Bio that is kind of new technologies with healing and sustainability. Maybe looking at the hot topics of interest or some of the subgroups in a professional organization. I may not completely answer your question, but it might be a place to start.
And CJ, I'd also recommend, you said you're a chemist, check out with the American Chemical Society what sort of resources they might have within their policy office. There's also places like the Brookings Institute have pretty broad portfolios. There are some think tanks that are very specialized only on one particular topic or broader. So I think Brookings is a good example of a more broad think tank. But yeah, I think what Spencer said in terms of looking into it and getting back to you, I think is the best answer here, which by the way, is a totally fine thing to say in the policy world. I think as scientists, sometimes we think that we always have to have the answer and always have to have the information at our fingertips. But as you can see from this real life example, you don't always have that, but you can say, I'll look into it for you. I'll get some more information and continue the conversation that way.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson, for offering to do that. Dr. Posey, did you have a question?
Yes, I had a quick question, I guess, for anybody on the panel. So I am one of the people who kind of got told postdoc or what's the point of your PhD. So I'm currently in a postdoc right now at Texas Children's Hospital in Houston. And I was curious, a lot of the things you guys mentioned, it was like fellowships that were, akin to postdocs, but if you don't really want to kind of be in a perpetual postdoc, what kind of options are there? I mean, just with a quick Google search, there really aren't a lot of things that just pop up when you search science policy. So I didn't know if there's maybe specific keywords to look for, if there's different names for things for people who've like already done their postdocs, just kind of that take on it.
I'll tackle one thing and just say that maybe when searching, science policy is one thing, and you might find some things under that heading. But if you are, I think it's probably easier to go directly, like others have said, to different societies to really try to find those types of jobs. Also, maybe if you are interested in more going into government relations, looking at things like governmental affairs, it's not all like the words that we use, maybe like we say lobbyists, but you don't really search up lobbyists on Google, like there's official titles. So using the more official titles for lobbyists as government affairs, that might be helpful as well. That's the only very minimal advice that I have, just, in even in me trying to find people, trying to find the right person that I need to talk to about a particular thing, having to know the right thing to search for as well. So it's a journey that I'm on as well, being a legislator.
Yeah.
It was the specific wording that I was like, I figured you guys had some insight into.
The more specific you can be, the better. So like science policy is too broad. Nobody's hiring for just science policy. Usually they have a specific thing. So like you have a health background, searching for health policy analyst, health policy associate, health policy fellow, specifically having that, because health is like the broadest specific phrase that is used for that field. That will probably open up a bunch more doors because nobody is hiring for just science. That's really hard. Like if you're coming into this new world of policy, you don't know what the language is, you don't know what the lexicon is. It can be definitely hard to know what the search terms are because that's the key for unlocking Google. But yeah, I would look at like health policy analyst and health policy associate or health policy fellow. Like those three combinations of search terms, you'll probably find a lot.
Thanks, appreciate it.
I'll ask a question that came from registration unless someone else wants to hop in and ask their question now.
I'll ask a question. So, how did you approach the transition of being around scientists to being around mostly policy people?
Well, I can start with this one by saying that one of the things that that was probably one of my biggest challenges, being around people who care about science to being around people who just honestly did not care that much. When I'm in the room and I'm like, hey, y'all, but wait, the science says this. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. That was really difficult for me, but it also honed a skill for me that I needed to work on. And that was really communicating with people who are non-scientists about the science. So it was a transition, and I will admit, and in the beginning, it was very tough. While people respected the fact that I was in science, and they would say things like, oh, like, that's amazing, and you must be really smart, and all these things. When it came down to actual legislating and lawmaking, they would be very quick to discount the science just because it wasn't their thing and they hadn't really had to think about it before. So for me, it was a little bit tougher, but I'm learning to just be a better communicator of the science in a way that's not super sciencey and just understanding my audiences, which is something that we talked about quite a bit today on the panel.
And related to that, I think understanding that other people who aren't scientists still are very smart, have a lot of knowledge about their topic areas. So while you might, be an expert in your particular thing and, think you're really smart and know what you're talking about, there are other people that know just as much, if not even more, about their particular areas of policy or how government works or how an agency works. So I think having a little bit of openness and listening to just where other people are coming from, respecting the kind of expertise that they bring to the table. And, you're good at science, they're good at government, work together with people and find those partnerships. So I think, getting used to just respecting other people's expertise and being willing to realize that other people know a ton about their individual topics and you have a lot to learn from other people too.
So I agree with everything that other panelists have said on this, and we'll just chime in with a couple of other things. One is that in stepping out from academia and into this world of the State Department, I spent some time trying to really understand or anticipate what some of the cultural norms would be. So, organizational cultural norms. And so, some of that boils down to things as simple as kind of what's the work uniform? How should I show up for work on my first day? And so just trying to be really open to learning about organizational culture, organizational norms, I think is important. And then, as I was arriving into my new job as a fellow, I kind of came in with this academic mindset of, okay, what are all the things that I need to read to understand the issues that I will need to be conversant in to do my job. And what I quickly discovered were a lot of things are not written down. And it boils down to identifying who you need to talk to understand the state of play on issues. And so that was a real shift for me. And I found that investing the time up front whenever I was changing jobs to really try to understand that landscape and connect with people was really crucial to being able to move within that landscape. And then before I end, Jasmine, I just wanted to ask if part of your question was also about making the decision about the transition, making the decision to go into the policy world, or was it really more about kind of figuring out how to navigate the policy world once we were there?
Yes, the second part, like once you're there and you're surrounded by people you're not used to talking to, and it could be, I feel like it could be a little confusing.
Absolutely. So I think, going in with a good measure of humility, recognizing that this is going to be a different environment and there's going to be a lot of learning involved, and having enough compassion with yourself to, be okay with making some mistakes along the way as you learn. I think all of those things play into succeeding.
Any other questions from our audience?
I do have a question, Dr. Marilyn. I'm so sorry, somebody else speaking?
No, go for it.
Go for it.
Okay, my name is Amit Ghoshal. I just defended my thesis, and finally, I'm free to choose my options. But as is with all the graduate students, it's almost like taking birth. You come out and you have no clue what the heck you're going to do. Fortunately or unfortunately for me, this is my second rodeo actually, because I have a prior PhD. And as usual, again, I took the wrong turn after my prior PhD. I initially wanted to teach, but I ended up in an industry position. Right now, I'm repeating the same problem, but I mean the same issue, but I think this is more cognizant with what I want in my future. I have a more practical view. And this is a question for Dr. Bando. Dr. Bando, I'm also from Northern California. We are from Napa. And definitely I'm interested in the first thing that you mentioned, that you're willing to be a point person. So my first question is it okay to get in touch with you? I do have a very diverse background, as you wanted. I have a bachelor's of science in biology, that's zoology, botany, chemistry, and physics. I have a law, which is a JD. I have a master's of business in marketing finance, and I have a master's of tourism administration. My prior PhD was in marketing, but my second PhD, which I just finished, is in ecology, environmental biology, sustainability. So is it okay if I get in touch with you? I just want some pointers. And trust me, I'm not going to be one of those leeches that is going to hang on to you. I just wanted some directions. I am so lost. Either I get into academia or I get into something that is going to determine my future. With a background in law, I do understand policy. I love policy. I just need the answer if I can get in touch with you. That's my first question.
So I would say absolutely yes. I'd be very glad to be in touch. And, also congratulations on such an amazing suite of accomplishments. I think it can be really hard to figure out the next steps in our paths. I would tell you that I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up. I'm not sure I ever will. And I think that's okay. So in my own career, I think my decisions about jobs and direction have often involved some degree of career experimentation. And when I talk about the AAAS fellowship, which was my first step into the policy world, I basically describe that as a personal career experiment. I was really interested as a graduate student and as a postdoc in working at the nexus of science and policy, but I frankly didn't know if I had the right personality and the skill set for it. And I thought, well, what better way to figure that out than to go to Washington and dip my toes in the water and see how it feels. And that's not always an option for everyone. I guess my point is that it's okay to be nonlinear in our approaches. I mean, obviously we've got a lot of panelists here and a lot of participants who have taken really interesting and nonlinear career paths, but I look forward to hearing from you and continuing the conversation.
One of the questions, Aaron, do you have a question?
Yes, I did. First of all, yeah, may I go ahead and ask? Thanks. First of all, thank you all so much. What an incredible panel. I mean, the credentials on this board, the experiences on this panel, like I'm fascinated. Thank you all so much for your time. My question is, I think that mentorship is a huge part of success. And given that you all have had such interesting tracks into science policy, do you have any advice on how to find good mentors, building, supportive networks and all that?
I can start off with this one. So I think it's important to have mentors who are at different spots in their careers as well. So it's good to have mentors that are maybe 3 to 5 years ahead of where you are in your career. It's good to have mentors that are a decade or more down the road, sort of so you can envision a path. Everyone's career is different. You can't really see exactly where, but I think it's helpful to know different stages along the way, and then you can approach different mentors at different places in their lives with different types of questions, because they might have just been where you are, or they were there but they got a lot more vision down the road throughout their next steps. So I think that's an important thing to have. And I think just keeping in touch with people throughout your career is really important, because you never really know who will pop up somewhere later in your life or who might end up in the same kind of career. Science policy is a pretty small world. So a lot of the people that I met earlier in my policy career, I'm still seeing around in DC. So I think if you have a good connection with someone and you're willing to stay in touch with them, if they're willing to stay in touch with you, I think keeping those relationships strong is really important, not only for your own personal growth, but then your ability to work in policy and be part of that world. So it's tough. It's an art, not a science, to find good mentors and to be a mentor to people. But I think basing it on that relationship, if you vibe with someone, if you get good feelings from them and you have, you want to emulate their career or want to emulate some of the characteristics that they have in themselves as a professional, I think those are the sort of things you can look for.
Thank you.
There are several active mentorship programs at Texas A&M. I can send you the link or actually I'll put my email in the chat. If you would like to email me, I'll connect you to the A&M mentorship programs. That might be an option.
Excellent. Thank you so much for offering that resource too.
No, it's very, instead of reinventing the wheel, it's very helpful to have insights from people that are further in the process than you. Okay, one of the questions that was submitted with the registration, it's a two-part question. Part of it, I think comments have been touched on, but I'll ask the question, to what extent do you get to shape policy? And the second part is, how difficult is it to navigate politics? And I think we've had a little bit of discussion on that, but it was a really interesting question.
I will take this. It really depends a lot on the specific role in the specific agency. Different agencies delegate different levels of responsibility to political staff or to career staff, which I know is not maybe a super helpful answer. Kind of depends on your boss. I think if you're looking at a science policy role, you should ask around about that agency or that office to understand how they operate, because it varies quite a lot. I had a lot of responsibility to write a lot of legislation in my history, but I don't think that's always necessarily the case. Some congressional offices will delegate to their staff, others will delegate just to lobbyists on the outside. And then in some agencies, it's heavily controlled by political appointees, and in some agencies, it's delegated to career staff. It can be really difficult to navigate the politics of an issue if it is a politically contentious issue. So I work on climate and clean energy policy. It's very contentious, it takes a lot of time, but there are plenty of other types of issues that I've been able to work on that were much less politically contentious, like uranium import tariffs from Russia. Everybody agreed that we should reduce our reliance on Russian uranium. So that one was easier. It kind of depends on, you know, how political is your topic. That will dictate how difficult it is to navigate the politics. Would love anyone else's thoughts on that. That's a very broad question. It's difficult to answer.
I can give a perspective from being a lawmaker in that, you know, a lot of people think that I have this magic wand and I can make whatever policy I want to happen all by myself. Just do it. It's not necessarily the case. There is a lot more involved in getting legislation passed. There's a lot of steps involved. And so the extent that I am able to change policy or make policy really boils down to, you know, my ability to get something a hearing and my ability to get everyone in the room, or at least the majority of the people in the room, to agree with whatever is being proposed. And that's when you realize that you're one of many. And so relationships are really important. Being very clear about what you are trying to do is very important. Being very prepared to make your argument is very important. So I say that to say, depending on where you are in the country, you know, if you were to decide to run for office, if you are running for office and you are a member of the minority party, your ability to make policy might be very different than if you're running as a member of the majority party. You know, but there's no guarantees either way. And so making policy is bigger than just writing good legislation. It really is a multifaceted approach and involves a lot of conversations and just making sure you know your stuff. So.
And to piggyback off of that, I think finding the right allies for your policy and finding a coalition of people to work with that support the same policies will really impact how much you can actually get done. You know, you can have one thing that you'd really like to push for, but at the end of the day, you're one university or you're one scientific society, and why would Congress listen to you? But if you have a whole group, you know, if you've got a bunch of people that all support, say, more money for the NIH budget, and everyone can agree on, let's push for this number for the budget for this year. And then everyone goes to the Hill with the same message, and everyone has different perspectives on why this is important, you know, coming from all sorts of different angles, different arguments. That's a lot more effective of a way of getting a policy through or getting some sort of budget that you would like than if you're working on your own. So I think finding what kind of groups out there you might be aligned with, and sometimes that can be surprising, you know, especially in a very highly political environment. You might have thoughts that, oh, we would never be able to work with this member of Congress because they believe this. But maybe that's only on one issue, but on a different issue, they might be really aligned with where you're coming from. So I think being open to having different allies for different topics and finding common ground to work on different things will make you a lot more effective as an advocate, as someone who's pushing for policy, than if you're trying to go it alone.
Dr. Granatosky, your answer really touched on another question, where what are the biggest challenges you find in communication with policymakers? So your advice to find common ground and really speaks to that question as well. Any other ideas about how to solve challenges with communication? I know we've touched on that a bit already, to listen and be respectful and try to hear different perspectives. Just wondered if anyone had any other comments.
I would just go back to a point that was made earlier in this panel about knowing your audience. And I'll share a story about being a science fellow in the State Department and getting a question from the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs about whether we had an environmental strategy for the Americas. And my answer to him, in an email was, well, we don't have a formal strategy, but our approach is basically encapsulated in documents X, Y, and Z. And my boss at the time wrote back to me and very gently redirected me. He said, when the assistant secretary asks if we have a policy on something, the answer is never no. If we don't have a policy, we write one. And so I thought, okay, well, this is my first sort of, really meaty tasking as a science fellow. And I said, well, how long should the policy be? Thinking this is going to be a really complex document. And he said, I think we can get it down in 1 page. And, 1 page at the State Department, at least at the time, meant 1 page in 14-point font with 1-inch margins. But the point of this story is that it's really important to know, how much bandwidth does a policymaker have for the information that we're providing, and, understanding their assumptions, and also, competing priorities is really important as we try to carry forward policy information and agendas.
The answer is always yes. One student asked if there's anything you dislike or find challenging about science policy or miss about doing bench work.
Sometimes I miss the tactical experience of doing bench work. In policy, you spend most of your time at a computer or in meetings or taking notes, talking to people. But I really enjoyed, I know this sounds silly, but pipetting or, plating something on an agar plate or something. So that sort of different experiences and getting up and walking around, sometimes I miss that part of it. But I think I really do enjoy the work that I'm doing now. I think it can be challenging, some of the political considerations that we touched on, and finding ways to get your ideas through. And, there's a lot going on in Washington all of the time. So how do you make sure that your message rises to the front? How do you get allies and get attention for your different topics? I think all of that can be tough. But overall, I would say I really enjoy what I do. And I think it's important to think about the day-to-day of what you're doing, what type of work you like. So I always knew that I liked writing, I liked talking, I liked thinking about science. Apart from sometimes the physical aspect of doing the science, I didn't really like doing the experiments. So I think if you can think about what parts of a job you actually want to do, I think that can help you when the job gets challenging. Like you said, you like writing about science, just write this memo, get it over with. So I think keeping that in mind is important in navigating some of the day-to-day experiences.
I miss nerding out. I miss being around people who appreciated the science as much as I did in the lab. But at the same time, I'm also in the classroom now. And so that's my opportunity to continue to nerd out with my students. They look at me like I'm crazy of the things I get excited about, but I like science, and I always have liked science, and I get excited talking about science. And so I still get a little bit of that in my classrooms when I'm, at work at Emory. But I will say that I love the ability to take my science into the legislature. I actually enjoy reading a bill and just looking for the right question to ask. It's like my new favorite thing to do. And I've been known for asking questions, but it's fun, and it's something I really enjoy doing. And so for me, I say, yes, I miss some of the sciencey nerding out part of science and being in the lab. But I have really found a way to really translate my background and my education in science to legislating. And I'm really enjoying exploring that and expanding that every single day, and finding new ways to really use that in a meaningful way. So it's still fruitful, even when I'm not getting the nerd out in the lab.
Sounds like you found your niche.
So this might just be a nerdier way of saying that I miss nerding out, but I guess I would say that I miss the joy of discovery that's inherent to the business of doing science. And while working on a policy problem and finding a solution is really satisfying, it's just different. And what I don't personally find frustrating, but I know that a lot of people who are coming into the policy realm can sometimes find frustrating, is that the best policy solution isn't the most logical one or the most elegant one. It's the one that's been built with the right people who have, who are invested in the solution. And so a lot of this boils down to, the different interests and equities and concerns of different stakeholders in the process. And so the relationships and the learning and the consensus building that goes along with building a policy solution can sometimes feel frustrating, I think, and slow to people, but I think that's an inherent part of the work and can also be very satisfying.
We talked a little bit about how to find a mentor, but there was a question for a career in advocacy or public service. Is it normal or common, I guess, to work with a mentor? Just wondered from your perspectives, what you think.
I would say that based on my experience, it is normal to have mentors, but the system, the institution is not necessarily going to set that up for you. And so it requires a degree of proactiveness on the part of an individual to reach out. I think that there's generally a culture and I'm speaking from the lens of public service, I think generally there is a desire to help, junior professionals to be successful in their jobs. And so there's generally a high degree of receptivity when people ask for help, but often I think the person who is seeking mentors really has to be the one who's reaching out instead of waiting for someone to come in and make the offer.
Yeah, I don't know that that might not be even be a science policy specific thing. That might just be like when you're leaving academia. But yeah, you definitely need to be very outgoing on finding mentors. But I've also found that, once you have a really good relationship with someone, like that can continue for a long time, and you'll find your group of people who are all with you. And then that's always going to be really helpful in advancing your career. At least in DC, it shouldn't be this way, but it's extremely nepotistic. So if you want to find a job, a lot of times the jobs will be filled before they're ever posted. And even if they are posted, they're not actually, they might have already had someone in mind for that job once it is posted. So it's not a good system, but it is the system as it exists today in DC. So having mentors is very important because they're going to hear about things that you probably wouldn't hear because they're more senior than you are.
This question kind of made me smile. Is science policy a lucrative career option, similar to industry, research and industry? There's probably several answers to that.
Yeah, I think the answer to this is it depends. As many of the questions we approached today, I think it depends a lot on the sector that you're in. If you're in a private sector versus some sort of public position, there's potential to be paid more than if you're in a public position. Hill salaries are notoriously kind of low for the amount of work and expertise that you bring to the table. So that's, if you do want to work on the Hill, that's something you have to balance between the passion of working there and potentially a lower salary than you might get elsewhere. A lot of federal positions are on a GS scale, so there are set salaries for each position, and you move up the scale as you gain more expertise in your career, so that's a little more transparent. Some firms are not as transparent because it's the private sector and they don't have to be. So I think it really depends on where you're working, where you're at in your career. it really depends. So sorry if that's not the most helpful thing, but I think that's true for almost any field that you're in. It really depends on where you're working.
I can answer this question. Being a state representative in Georgia is not lucrative at all, like not even a little bit. We make $17,000 a year. That is it. But it is part-time. It is part-time. You're still expected to be available all throughout the year, but you're only paid for the 40 legislative days that we are actually in session. And that is equivalent to the $17,000. Most people have a job, a full-time job. Like I said, my full-time job is working at Emory, and that's the job that pays the bills. I did not go into public policy to get rich. A lot of my constituents don't know that. So they assume that I am, I'm getting very rich off of this, and I am not even close. Yeah, I didn't go into this to make a whole lot of money. Honestly, I didn't even really go into science to make a whole lot of money. So I think that I followed my heart on this one. So if money is like super duper important to you, I would just say do not run for state representative in Georgia unless you have another job that is going to make you a lot of money. Just being honest.
Yeah, it varies a lot. I was paid well on the energy committee because some committees pay the staff who work on committee more. But if you started in like a very basic level in a Senate office or House office, you would get paid very poorly. A lot of the agency jobs don't pay well at the beginning, but they pay very well after you've been there for 20 years. So that's a big difference. And then also, like, if you work on the Hill for 10 years and then you go and work in government affairs, you could be paid very handsomely. So you have a low pay period and a high pay period. And then there's a huge difference between different types of think tanks. Some think tanks pay a lot, some think tanks pay very little. I think it's becoming more and more okay just to ask up front, what is the pay band for this, for this job? And if an employer is not willing to tell you that up front, then that's probably not a very good place to be applying. So, definitely make sure that you have an understanding of what you're worth and what you need. And also, don't be afraid to ask that question. This is kind of a down question. This is kind of a bad question to end it with. I also agree with Representative Clark that going into this is definitely something that is really important just from the heart of caring about trying to have evidence-based, science-backed policymaking. And you can definitely make it work. And there are a million different policy opportunities, and everybody here and in the broader science policy community wants more people to succeed. And anyone who's working in this community is going to be open to you reaching out and looking for opportunities.
Spencer, I appreciate you. I'm sorry, Marilyn, if I cut you off.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I appreciate Spencer trying to kind of, redirect us to end on a positive note here. I think, at the risk of sounding a little idealistic, I think it's good for us to try to find vocations that we can be passionate about. And I think that in the science policy world, there are so many ways to do work that feels meaningful and impactful, and to work with great teams of people. So I think there are great opportunities, great avenues within the science policy world to find that kind of work that we can feel passionate about.
And you have all demonstrated your passion and your desire to contribute, to value science, to communicate science, to create and enact helpful policies, useful policies. And it has been such an honor to listen to all of you share your paths and your experiences and your insights. So I I truly believe that students will walk away from this feeling, oh my gosh, I'm being trained to do this new thing in policy that I didn't even know existed. You know, I've had experiences that will help me be successful transitioning into this role. So I greatly appreciate all of your comments and wisdom today. Time for one last question from the audience. If anyone has a burning question that you want to ask. Well, I find it hard to believe we are coming up on 2 hours. The last 2 hours have flown by for me because it has been so enjoyable and informative. Hearing all of your insights, all of your experiences. I want to thank A staff and in particular Jasmine for all of their work in creating and marketing this event. And I want to thank all of the students that have stayed with us for 2 hours to listen to all of this information. And I would just like to thank each of our panelists for taking the time to be with us today. We want you to know how much we appreciate your speaking to us about your careers, about your experiences, and sharing your insights with the students. We've kind of touched on it already in this event about how important it is to talk to people that are working in the career that you're considering. And you have given the students a great gift today. You made it very easy for them. They were able to do several informational interviews in one sitting. So thank you very much. Please join me. This is when I wish this was not virtual because you won't be able to actually see, but maybe you'll be able to hear if people unmute and say thank you. So please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation. It was a great experience to be here. And I think everyone wants you to keep in touch. So please do reach out and don't be afraid to reach out to anyone who really works in the policy space. People are happy to chat. Thanks.
It was so interesting.